Okay, I have a chart I'm working on, and she's a friend, so I do know a bit about her. And I'm having a hard time teasing out all the planets in her 10th house, separating them from the mother. I have the mother, but I really want to be able to talk about the career. And I'm just checking with the approach so that I'm looking at each planet universally, and then if I'm looking at them universally, won't look at the lordship. I won't relate universal indication with a lordship rulership. But I'm curious, should I be looking at universal um, significators with the aspects as well? And do I start moving into lordship at all?
The question has to do with how do we navigate talking about the career within a person's natal chart based on an assessment of the 10th house. Now, we know that the 10th house has the ability to give us many things. One of the things the 10th house gives us is an understanding of our mother, and the other major thing the 10th house gives us is an understanding of our career. Now, for me and for us at the Oraculos School of Astrology, we've created a means of teasing out these two topics. So, specifically for the mother, we take the ruler of the 10th house, or the planet that rules or is the domicile ruler of the sign that's on the cusp of the 10th house, and we use the 10th house itself as being indicative of the career. Any planet that is within your 10th house is more than likely going to be a planet that is more highly elevated within your chart than any other planet. And the reason why I say more than likely is because you might have a planet that's in your 10th house but pretty close to the 11th house cusp, and a planet that's in the 9th house but that's closer to the midheaven itself. So, for the most part, any planet that's in your 10th house is going to be a very highly elevated planet within your chart in general. And one of the things that I have found is that when we have a planet that's highly elevated within our chart, that planet oozes its influence out across the entirety of the landscape of our chart. And so, a lot of peoples with planets conjunct their 10th house cusp oftentimes find those planets being very key players within the larger unfolding of their lives, for better or for worse. There are really just two reasons why this is the case. One of the reasons is because the midheaven is one of the most sensitive parts of our entire horoscope. And from a Uranian astrology perspective, the midheaven is actually representing you as the native within your chart. Whereas from a traditional astrology perspective, the ascendant is representing the native within the chart. But the midheaven, from a Uranian astrology perspective, represents the I, the self, and everything that makes a person exactly who they are. So if you have a planet that is conjunct your 10th house cusp, the fact is that that planet is going to manifest more fully through the entirety of your self understanding than perhaps any other planet. Any planet that is conjunct our midheaven or in very tight hard aspects to our midheaven is a planet that is going to be directly playing out within the larger unfolding of the person we end up being within this lifetime. That comes to us from Uranian astrology. That isn't necessarily something we find being said within traditional astrology, but even within the context of traditional astrology, the highest elevated planet is the most visible planet within our charts, and as such, has a very strong ability to influence and impact every other sphere of our lives. Now, when it comes to specifically speaking about the vocation within a horoscope, this is a very tricky question and it's a very tricky topic because who we end up being from a career perspective isn't just having to do with the planets that are in our 10th house, but it has to do with the entirety of who we are in general and the sort of self we bring to the world in general. And from a traditional astrology perspective, the only way to really understand who a person is within their natal chart is through an assessment of the ascendant. And that can be through assessing the element of the ascendant, the mode of the ascendant, the ruler of the ascendant. planets within the first house, aspects to the ascendant, the location of the ruler of the ascendant, aspects to the ruler of the ascendant. All of these things can be very important in the larger unfolding of understanding who a person is within this lifetime. And very often, that larger composite of who that person is says more to us about the sorts of career aspirations they're going to have for themselves than necessarily just assessing the 10th house and the ruler of the 10th house by itself. Now, planets within the 10th house can very much impact the sorts of career that we find ourselves going into, but they can also impact the sort of experience that we have within that career. For example, if you have Mars within your 10th house, you can find yourself working within a very Martian environment. And that can be law enforcement, or that can be working within any facet of the legal system in general, but it can also indicate that you find yourself being in a very conflict prone career environment, and that may not necessarily be something that gives you the greatest sense of ease within the context of the work that you're doing. Conversely, if you find Venus within the 10th house, that can indicate that you're working within a career environment that is lovely and that is soft and that is gentle, where people care about each other and people want to know how other people feel. And it's about the sensitivities that we bring to the sort of work that we do that really guides how we operate within those Venusian careers. And some Venusian careers could be careers in counseling or public relations or human resources or therapy, whether that's talk therapy, touch therapy, or any of the therapeutic modalities. But we can also be working within a sensual or an artistic field that allows us to deal with the non-tangibles of life, but that also allow us to create more beauty within the world. If we have Saturn within the 10th house, that could represent that our job is a place where we're facing our major challenges of growth and maturity within this lifetime. If we have the Sun in the 10th house, that can indicate that our job is where we're really isolating a large part of how we navigate the world, and our job is really the part of our lives where we shine the most. So having the various planets within the 10th house can indicate many things in terms of not just the type of job that we find ourselves gravitating towards, but also the quality of job experience we have while there. One of the interesting things that I found within some of the Chiron research that I do is that having Chiron conjunct our midheaven, or having Chiron as the highest elevated celestial factor within our charts, can oftentimes lead a person towards a medical career or a career where they're rendering some form of therapy or some form of care, whether it is complementary health care or primary health care. That person is rendering some form of care for their clients within the context of the work that they're doing. So all of the planets, when we have the various planets within our 10th house, the various planets do give us some understanding of what the quality of our career is going to be like. However, I do think that it's more important to judge who a person is first and then reverse engineer what sorts of careers we think that person might naturally gravitate towards. And it's not a matter of playing a guessing game, but if you have someone who has a very Saturnian chart because they have a Saturn sign rising, they're ruled by Saturn, they have Saturn in the first house, and they have aspects occurring to their first house cusp and to their Saturn that further bring out and that further amplify some of those Saturnian qualities and characteristics about them, then that can be a person who's naturally gravitating towards careers that have to do with more responsibility and careers that that have to do with them taking care of a large group of people, because that's one of the things that Saturn does. Saturn takes care of everybody down below. So a person who has a very Saturnian chart and who themselves may be very Saturnian might find themselves thrusted into managerial roles, or roles where they find themselves taking care of the collective, or roles where they find themselves working within a larger organization that takes care of the collective, such as people who have government jobs or jobs within larger institutions in which they find themselves responsible for a large group of people. Similarly, if you have a very Jupiterian ascendant, because you have a Jupiter sign rising and you have a very strong Jupiter within your chart, and you have aspects to that Jupiter that further bring out more of that Jupiterian characteristic or quality, then that could be a person who is having a very broad approach to life. They may be a jack of all trades. That person may be someone who is naturally open-hearted and who wants to travel the world and meet new people. And the sort of job that they might find themselves being attracted to might be a job having to do with travel, or with some humanitarian endeavor, or something that broadens the scope of the perspective of what they're doing, so that they find themselves interacting with a more international audience, or they find themselves interacting with people who are thinking up big new ideas, or they find themselves operating within a more visionary capacity within the sort of job that they do. So very often our charts can tell us the sort of qualities and characteristics we bring to our jobs. It can also tell us the sorts of quality that we would find within the context of the jobs that we find ourselves gravitating towards. And it stands to reason that our charts can also tell us whether we're going to work in a very dignified field and a very opulent or a very rarefied field, or whether we're going to be working in the field, doing grunt work. However, the larger point is that all of these career indicators come together to give us a composite image of who the person is more fully, and then from understanding who that person is, we can then understand the way how they're showing up within this lifetime from a career perspective. Having planets within our 10th house will also give us more information about the sort of careers that we're gravitating towards. And I think it's also important to note that if we have planets within the 10th house, and those planets are one of the 7 classical planets of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, or the Moon, if those planets are ruling other houses within your chart, then those planets can show other impacts on your career. So say, for example, you have the ruler of the 5th house within your 10th house. That could be that children are playing a very major role within your career, or it can be that art and creativity are playing a very major role within your career. If you have the ruler of the 3rd house within your 10th house, that could say that you're operating or working within a communicative field, but it could also say that you're working within an educational field. If you have the ruler of the 7th house in your 10th house, that can say that you're probably working with your partner, or you probably have a business partner within the context of the work that you're doing. If you have the ruler of the 9th house within your 10th house, then that's probably saying that you're working within a higher educational capacity, or you're working in a job that pertains to 9th house things. So we do want to make sure that we're paying attention to the houses that planets rule, if those planets are within our 10th house, because those things will also augment the sort of career circumstances we find ourselves being gravitated towards. But we also want to make sure that we have a very clear understanding of who the person is who has the chart, because that's also going to give us more information. And when we bring together these pieces of information, it gives us a very clear understanding of the possibilities that a person has in the front of them as far as their career is concerned within this lifetime.
That was really helpful to go to the ascendant to get the nature of the person first. I do want to go back to whether we do, if we're just doing universal significators, will we do any kind of, as we'll do aspects with that for 10th house career. And then I just feel like I'm going to slip over to, if I'm doing universal significators, for example, the moon, I there's such a strong presence of the moon being the sister in the chart. So if it's up in the 10th house, right on the midheaven, I'm supposed to ignore that it's L3, or, you know, basically ignore it.
So the other part of this, which I think is a very important piece, is that if a person has their sibling as the highest elevated planet within their chart, then that oftentimes indicates that their sibling took up an extraordinary amount of space within their life growing up. That's something that I found to happen time and time again, that when a person has their sibling as the highest elevated planet within their chart, also if you have your sibling in the 11th house as well, of your hopes and dreams and aspirations, then it can say that one of your hopes and dreams and aspirations was to be very much like your sibling, or your sibling is someone who you looked up to a great deal, which is why that person is in your 11th house. But if you have your sibling as the highest elevated person within your chart, then it can say that your sibling took up an extraordinary amount of space within the context of your home environment, and that could have possibly been a point of contention for you within your early childhood life. That's something that tends to pan out more often than not, especially if you don't have a good aspect relationship between you and your sibling within your chart. Then it simply shows that your sibling took up far too much space within the household and home, and that the story of your sibling is still probably taking up far too much space within your life in general. Now, moving into the realm of universal significations, and this is where things get a little bit blurry, and that's why I always like to have a very clear line between when I'm looking at a planet as a universal significator versus when I'm looking at a planet as a specific significator because it's ruling a particular house. When I am looking at a planet as a universal significator, I bar everything else from my mind and I only talk about it in that capacity. So if I have Moon in the 10th house, then I think about this person as a very nurturing person. This person is probably someone who likes to feed people, whether she's literally cooking food or whether she's feeding people within her life emotionally. She's a caretaker, and that's a quality that she's probably taking into any career or profession she might find herself in. And she is a maternal person in general, and so the sort of career she finds herself in are going to be careers that draw out that natural maternal instinct that she's having within this lifetime. So that's going to be something that I say about her from a career perspective. And when I'm done with assessing the planets in her 10th house as universal significators, then I will assess them as specific significators, at which point nothing I said about the maternal nature before even matters, because at that point I will then be speaking about that moon as the sister, and the sister who took up too much space in her life growing up, and the sister who was probably the favorite child of the mother, and the sister and the sister and the sister. But I will never speak about the universal significators in the same breath with which I speak about planets as specific significators, because then we start to muddy our astrology. So if you're taking a planet through the ropes from a universal perspective, only do that. And then after you've done that to your satisfaction, then you can take that same planet through the ropes from a specific signification perspective. Which houses does this planet rule? And then do that. And after that, you have nothing more to do. The final thing I'll say about this is that if you have the moon in the 10th house and that moon is squaring Saturn, I'm not going to interpret that as a person who has a job that is moon Saturn. I'm going to interpret that as a person who has a job that is moon, or that is lunarian or of the moon. because determination by location is immediate. I'm not going to start taking in all the aspects that that moon is making in order to give me more commentary about the job just because the moon is in the 10th house. Because if you do that, you set yourself up to participate in a vicious cycle where you continuously find more and more things to say and you're never quite done yet. And we need to be able to be done. So when it comes to judging planets in the 10th house, determination by location is immediate. What do those planets mean universally, and how can we put those meanings together to create a composite image of the job of the person that is sitting in the front of us? And then secondarily, what do those planets mean based on the houses they rule, and how does that serve as a further augmenting factor in terms of the sort of job this person is being attracted to? Because if you have the ruler of your 3rd house in your 10th house, then maybe your sister took up that much space within your life because you had to take care of your sister for a very large part of your sister's life. And as a result of that, taking care of people is just something that you know how to do well, and you're bringing that within the context of your work. Be that as it may, we still need to deal with these two things that a planet can potentially rule separately. What does it mean universally? Complete that treatment of its universal significations, and then take a look at what it means specifically. And if you follow that pattern, you'll be on the side of the angels and you won't go wrong in terms of how you're delineating those planets.
Yes, thank you. And I do have one more part of it. Just their dignities, at what point are you using the dignity throughout for both universal and lordship in this 10th house area?
So, first of all, did that thing I said about her sister apply for
Yes,
her?
yes, absolutely.
So, tell us some of the sister stories so that we can just flesh it out.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know specific, but she's a great embarrassment or burden to her, my friend. They're adults at this point, and the sister has to be supported by the parents still. And the sister blames my friend's partner for a lot of things. There's an opposition to Mars, which is L7. So the sister story is really, burdensome, complicated, ongoing.
What we just heard was corroboration of what I said earlier without even seeing the chart. And I think that that's also a very important thing to be able to know that as astrologers, if we hear about where planets are within a person's chart, our mind should already be able to put together a story. So the story I put together was that the sister is taking up a ridiculous amount of space within this lady's life, and that could have been a very major part of her story growing up. And we just heard corroboration that that indeed was the case. And so we need to have this sort of way of thinking about everything, because no matter what planet you hear about in whichever house, we should automatically have some sort of feedback that we can give to a person about what those various planets mean in the various houses. Now, beyond that, when it comes to essential dignity, I don't use peregrination in natal astrology, and I don't use any of the minor dignities in natal astrology. So what this means is that I only use domicile, detriment, exaltation, and fall when it comes to natal astrological work. The other dignities, such as triplicity, term, and face, are important as well, but I find them to be far more important within horary astrology and electional astrology. I've never seen a natal chart in which someone has had the ruler of the blah blah house in its triplicity, term, or face, and it made a difference. And I know that there are many people who argue that it does make a difference, and I argue that I work with clients every single day, and it doesn't seem to make a difference. So the point is, I don't think it makes that much of a manifest difference for us to be talking about triplicity, term, and face within the context of our natal astrological practice. Similarly, I don't think it really is important for us to be talking about peregrine planets within our natal astrology practice. Who knows? Maybe the reason for that is because I'm lazy and I just don't want to do the sort of work necessary to see whether or not a planet is peregrine or not. I actually think that that is probably a very large part of why I don't do it, but I also don't do it because I find that it doesn't add anything material to what we're doing. And if I'm going to say anything about those planets at all, and those planets aren't in their domicile, detriment, exaltation, or fall, then whatever else I have to say about that planet is going to be provided by the house location of that planet and the aspects that that planet is receiving. This is a different conversation from our conversation about vocation, because the vocational conversation is that in order to determine the vocation of a person from their birth chart, we first need to know who that person is based on a complete and thorough assessment of the ascendant, planets in the ascendant, aspects to the ascendant, ruler of the ascendant, house location of the ruler of the ascendant, aspects to the ruler of the ascendant. Because that will tell us who that person is in this lifetime to begin with. And very often the sort of jobs that people find themselves attracted to are jobs that are fully within conformity with who they are in general. People who are attracted to creative jobs are people who tend to be more creative. People who are attracted to analytical jobs aren't necessarily secret musicians in disguise, but if they're genuinely attracted to an analytical job, it's because that person tends to be analytical in general. So people tend to be attracted to jobs that more fully resonate with who they are internally. And so the first part of doing any sort of vocational astrological work is being able to identify who a person is in astrological terms, which is why that's actually the first proficiency of a professional astrologer. The first thing you should be able to do when you pick up a person's natal chart is to be able to specifically identify who that person is within this lifetime. And if you can't do that, you need to go back to astrology school, because that's literally the first thing. The first house gives us that information, and therefore you need to be able to do that. And then from there, knowing who that person is, then you can know, how does this person respond to money? How will this person respond to their family story? How will this person respond to their children? How will this person respond to getting sick? How will this person respond to their spouse? How will this person respond to the thought of death? How will this person respond to religion? How will this person respond to their job? But we have to understand who the person is, which is the first thing. The second thing is the planets in the 10th house will also provide us nuance or understanding about the sort of job a person is being drawn towards. First of all, we have to interpret those planets universally, and then we can put together a hodgepodge and say, based on these planets being together, I believe this person is going to be more so attracted to this type of work than this other type of work. And then after we've assessed those planets universally, that's really the end of our job discussion, because we're not going to also take aspects to those planets, because that's taking it a step too far. So all we're going to do is assess the planets in the 10th house to tell us about the person's job potential or possibilities within this lifetime, as well as the sort of job they find themselves gravitating towards. And then after we do that, we begin to assess which houses those planets rule, because that's going to tell us people who are having, or circumstances that are having, a major impact on that person's career life within this lifetime. And like I said before, if you have your sibling within your 10th house, that can oftentimes be a bit of a cantankerous situation, because the question then becomes, why is this sibling so important that they are in my 10th house? And truthfully, this is the number one way to practice good astrology, because if we have a planet in a house, we have to figure out, why should this planet be in this house for me within this lifetime? If you have your spouse in your second house of money, the question is, why is my spouse in my second house of money? If you are in the second house of your spouse, you have to ask yourself, why am I in my spouse's house of money? If you have your siblings in your second house of money, you have to ask yourself, why are my siblings in my second house of money? And similarly, if you have your siblings in your 10th house, which is the most visible house within your chart, you have to ask yourself, what about my siblings and their story makes them so important that they are dominating such a large sphere of my life? Why are my siblings in my 10th house? And very often it's because your siblings took up too much space in your life to begin with. But then moving into the story about the essential dignity and ability is really taking it a step too far, because all we really need to do from a vocational astrology perspective is understand who the person is, and we get that from the ascendant, and then we have to understand what's going on with the 10th house, and we get that from the planets in the 10th house. If there are no planets in the 10th house, then we can also use the ruler of the 10th house, aspects to the ruler of the 10th house position of the ruler of the 10th house. But I oftentimes find that those things are going to be more descriptive of the quality of the job experience and not necessarily of specifically what the job is. So if you have the ruler of the 10th house very, very, very afflicted, then that can be descriptive of your job being very, very, very afflicted and not necessarily descriptive of what the job is. And I think that that's kind of what this question was about. How do we go about identifying what the job is within the chart and not necessarily what the quality of the job is? So I've given you all the things you need. You have to understand who the person is, which is a huge part, because after you've done that, you pretty much know how this person is going to show up in the world from a career perspective, and you pretty much also have a very good idea about the sort of careers that that specific person and personality will potentially be drawn towards.
That's awesome, Mychal. Thank you so much. That really helps.
You're very, very welcome, Lynn. You're very, very welcome.